Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Bell Witch haunting. Before the whispers and the violence that would eventually claim a life, there was a simple farm in the rolling hills of Adams, Tennessee. It is late autumn in the year 1817. The air has turned sharp, carrying the scent of dried cedar and the damp, heavy earth of the Red River Valley. Imagine yourself standing on the porch of a sturdy log farmhouse. The wood beneath your feet is worn smooth by years of footsteps, and the world around you is draped in a blanket of twilight. The sky is a deep, bruised purple, fading into a cold, ink-black horizon. Here, in this quiet corner of the frontier, the Bell family lived a life of quiet prosperity. John Bell, a man of 57 years, was respected by his neighbors and loved by his children. But as the frost began to silver the edges of the corn husks, a change took hold of the land. It was a subtle shift at first, a feeling of being watched by eyes that did not belong to the woods. Breathe in the cool night air. Let the tension leave your shoulders as we travel back to that first unsettling afternoon in the cornfield. The afternoon sun was hanging low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of dried corn. John Bell walked alone through the field, his boots crunching rhythmically against the frozen soil. The sound was the only thing breaking the silence of the valley, a steady, comforting beat of a man tending to his harvest. The corn stalks, now tall and brittle, rattled against one another in a sudden, stray breeze, sounding like the dry rustle of parchment. John stopped for a moment to adjust his heavy wool coat, the fabric coarse against his neck. He looked down the long, straight row of stalks, and that is when he saw it. Sitting perfectly still, right in the center of the path, was a creature that defied the logic of the natural world. It was the size of a large dog, with a thick, muscular torso covered in fur the color of wet ash. But as John squinted against the fading light, his breath caught in his throat. The head was not that of a dog. It was the head of a rabbit, with long, upright ears and dark, unblinking eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. The creature did not growl, and it did not flee. It simply sat there, watching him with a terrifying, human-like intensity that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand on end. The silence in the field became suffocating. The wind died down, and even the birds seemed to have vanished from the sky. John felt a cold sweat prickle his brow despite the biting temperature. His hand moved slowly, almost of its own accord, to the rifle he carried for protection against wolves. He raised the barrel, the metal cold and heavy in his grip. The creature did not flinch. It remained a motionless silhouette against the yellowing corn. John took a steadying breath, the scent of wood smoke and gunpowder filling his senses, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the valley, bouncing off the distant hills and shattering the quiet of the afternoon. A cloud of gray smoke bloomed in front of him, thick and acrid. When the veil of smoke finally drifted away, John lowered his weapon, expecting to see the fallen animal. But the row was empty. There was no body, no blood on the dry husks, and no sound of a creature scurrying through the underbrush. The cornfield was as still as a graveyard. John stood there for a long time, the ringing in his ears fading into a deep, heavy silence. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a stray dog and a tired mind, but the memory of those dark, rabbit-like eyes remained burned into his thoughts as he turned and walked back toward the safety of the farmhouse. That evening, the Bell home was a picture of domestic peace. The hearth fire crackled and hissed, sending a warm, amber glow dancing across the wooden walls and the faces of the children. The smell of roasted meat and cornmeal filled the room, providing a sense of security that John desperately needed after the events in the field. He sat at the head of the table, the weight of his silver fork and the hum of his family's conversation grounding him. He decided not to speak of the creature. He didn't want to frighten his wife, Lucy, or the younger children. But as the meal drew to a close and the family gathered around the fire, the atmosphere began to change. The wind outside picked up, clawing at the corners of the cabin, but through the whistling of the breeze, a new sound emerged. It was a dull, heavy thud. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of someone knocking on the door with their knuckles. It was the sound of something heavy beating against the exterior logs of the house. It was rhythmic and deliberate, moving from the front wall to the side, then around to the back. The children fell silent, their eyes wide and fixed on the sturdy oak door. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt insufficient against the cold dread that was creeping into the room. John and his sons, Drew and Richard, grabbed their lanterns and rushed to the door. The brass latch felt freezing as John threw it open, the heavy door swinging wide to reveal the darkness of the Tennessee night. The lanterns cast flickering, orange circles of light onto the frosted grass and the woodpile, but they saw nothing. No footprints in the thin layer of frost, no figure retreating into the shadows of the orchard. They walked the perimeter of the house, the light from their lanterns reflecting off the window panes like ghost fire. The air was perfectly still again. But the moment they stepped back inside and barred the door, the beating began again, louder this time. It sounded like the wings of a massive bird, flapping violently against the wood, or heavy chains being dragged across the porch. The house seemed to vibrate with the force of the blows. John looked at his sons, their faces pale in the candlelight, and he knew then that whatever had been in the cornfield had followed him home. The sounds were not those of a man or a beast they knew. They were the first notes of a haunting that would stretch across years, a slow, methodical stripping away of the peace they had worked so hard to build. For now, the noises remained outside, scratching at the periphery of their lives, but the threshold of the Bell farm had already been crossed by something unseen. The heavy oak door groaned as John pulled it shut, the iron hinges emitting a sharp, metallic cry that echoed through the narrow hallway. He leaned his weight against the wood, his breath coming in shallow, ragged plumes of white mist in the freezing night air. Outside, the wind continued its mournful whistle through the cedar trees, but the frantic scratching at the door had ceased. For a single, fleeting heartbeat, there was silence. A silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums like the weight of deep water. He looked down at his sons, Drew and Richard, whose faces were pale masks of confusion in the flickering, amber glow of the oil lanterns. The scent of kerosene and cold wood smoke hung thick in the air. Then, the sound returned. It did not come from the porch this time. It began as a faint, rhythmic ticking deep within the logs of the wall, moving upward with a sickening, liquid speed. It was the sound of long, sharp talons dragging across the interior timber, just inches from John's head. He pulled back, his eyes darting along the seams of the wall where the mud chinking was dry and cracked, but there was nothing to see. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, sounding like 1,000 invisible needles searching for a way through the grain of the wood. It was no longer a visitor at the door. The entity had found its way inside. The disturbance migrated from the walls to the floorboards, a heavy, dull thudding that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It sounded as though a massive, invisible weight was being dragged across the room, the wood groaning and protesting under a pressure that left no footprint. They followed the sound toward the children's sleeping quarters, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters against the ceiling. As they crossed the threshold, a new sound emerged from the darkness of the corners, a wet, persistent gnawing. It was the sound of teeth, large and jagged, grinding against the seasoned oak of the bedposts. John swung his lantern low, the light spilling across the floor to reveal the thick, hand-carved legs of the bed. He expected to see a wolf or a rabid dog, or perhaps the oversized rats that sometimes plague the river farms. But the wood was smooth and untouched. The sound was deafening, a harsh grating of bone against timber that set their teeth on edge. Yet when John reached out to touch the bedpost, it was cold and stationary. There were no teeth marks, no splinters, and no visible predator. The gnawing simply shifted, moving to the next bed, then the next, as if the invisible force were circling them, testing the boundaries of their sanctuary with a predatory patience. In the center of this burgeoning chaos stood Betsy Bell. She was only a young girl, her nightgown a pale blur in the dimness, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders in tangled waves. She had been silent until now, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to transcend her years. Suddenly, she gasped, her head snapping backward as if she had been seized by a handful of air. Her hands flew to her scalp, her fingers grappling with nothingness, yet her hair was being pulled upward with such violent force that she was lifted onto her tiptoes. A sharp, echoing crack rang out through the room, the sound of a palm striking flesh. Betsy's head jerked to the side, and a vibrant, angry red handprint began to bloom across her pale cheek, the outline of 4 long fingers and a thumb appearing as if burned into her skin by an invisible hand. She let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, helpless shock. Before her brothers could reach her, another blow landed, then another. The air around her seemed to ripple with a malevolent energy, a flurry of slaps and pinches that left her skin mottled with welts. It was not a random haunting. It was a targeted physical assault, an invisible cruelty that took pleasure in the vulnerability of a child. The family descended into a frantic struggle to protect her. Lucy Bell, the mother, rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter to shield her from the unseen strikes. She felt the air go cold around them, a localized chill that smelled faintly of damp earth and old brass. As she held Betsy, she felt the covers of the bed being yanked away by a powerful, invisible tug, the heavy quilts fluttering like dead leaves before being tossed into the center of the room. The pillows were snatched from beneath the children's heads and thrown against the far wall with a dull, heavy thud. John stood by, his rifle gripped so tightly his knuckles were white as bone, but there was no target to fire upon. He felt a sudden, sharp prickling across his own skin, like the sensation of dozens of needles being driven into his arms and chest. The room was alive with the sound of invisible dogs fighting, a cacophony of snarls, and the clashing of phantom teeth that seemed to rise from the very floorboards beneath their feet. They were trapped in a storm of the supernatural, a vortex of sound and touch that defied every law of the physical world they had spent their lives taming. As the hours of the early morning crawled by, the intensity of the manifestations did not wane. Instead, they evolved. The scratching and gnawing began to take on a rhythmic quality, a cadence that mimicked the heartbeat of the terrified family. The entity seemed to be learning, observing how they reacted to each new horror. Betsy lay exhausted in her mother's lap, her breathing shallow and hitching, her skin covered in small, red pinpricks that wept tiny beads of blood. Every time she closed her eyes, the scratching would start again, directly beneath her, as if the force were demanding her attention. The family huddled together in the center of the cabin, the embers in the fireplace casting a dying, crimson glow that barely reached the corners of the room. They watched the shadows, convinced that at any moment the invisible hands would coalesce into a form they could fight. But the shadows remained empty. The only proof of the intruder was the sound of chains being dragged slowly across the attic floor above them, a heavy, metallic rattle that spoke of burdens and old, restless sins. The Bell family sat in the suffocating darkness, realizing with a cold, sinking dread that the boundaries of their home had been breached, and the entity that now shared their air was not merely a ghost, but a presence with a will of its own. The scratching noises that had once dominated the late hours began to thin out, replaced by something far more unsettling than the sound of teeth against wood. Imagine the sound of a silk dress dragging across a floor of dry, autumn leaves, a soft, rhythmic rustle that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once, yet originated from nowhere. In the early months of 1818, the Bell family found themselves sitting in the dim, amber glow of their hearth, the shadows of the high-backed chairs dancing like giants against the rough-hewn logs. It was during these long, freezing hours that the whispers began. At first, they were nothing more than a series of low, whistling breaths, like the wind catching in the throat of a stone chimney. But as the family huddled closer together, the sounds coalesced into something recognizable. They began to hear the faint, melodic rise and fall of a voice. It was a woman's voice, though it sounded incredibly old and tired, as if it were traveling from a great distance or through a thick, suffocating layer of water. She was singing. The melody was familiar yet haunting, a hymn from the local church, perhaps, but the words were slightly blurred, the vowels elongated and strange, echoing with a metallic resonance that made the teeth ache. As the weeks turned into months, the whispers shed their frailty. The voice grew strong, gaining a sharp, jagged edge that cut through the silence of the farmhouse like a blade. It was no longer a distant echo. It was present, sitting in the room with them, though no body could be seen. When the local men, hardened by frontier life and weary of the mystery, gathered in the parlor to demand an identity, the entity finally answered. The sound was raspy and feminine, vibrating through the very floorboards until the soles of their boots felt the tremor. "I am a spirit," it declared with a chilling, crystalline clarity. "I was once very happy, but I have been disturbed and made unhappy." When pressed further by the trembling witnesses, it took on a name that sent a ripple of recognition and cold fear through the community. It claimed to be old Kate Batts' witch. Kate Batts had been a neighbor, an eccentric woman known for her sharp tongue, who believed John Bell had cheated her in a land transaction years prior. Whether the entity was truly the spirit of the living Kate or merely a demon adopting her name to weaponize old grievances, the effect was the same. The haunting had undergone a terrifying transformation. It was no longer a mindless force of nature. It was a sentient, calculating mind with a name, a history, and a clear, focused grudge. The intelligence of the entity was perhaps its most terrifying attribute, far surpassing the physical violence of the previous year. It did not merely scream or moan, it debated. Ministers from across the county, hearing of the Tennessee ghost, arrived at the Bell farm prepared to cast out a demon with scripture and prayer. They found themselves, however, hopelessly outmatched. The voice would engage them in deep, complex theological arguments, quoting the Bible with a precision that left the most learned preachers speechless. It would debate the finer points of Methodist fire and Baptist water, often laughing at the men's confusion with a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. On one famous occasion, the entity performed a feat that defied all logic. It recited, word for word, 2 different sermons that had been delivered that very morning in 2 different churches, located 13 miles apart. It mimicked the specific cadences and accents of the preachers, switching between them with a dizzying, mocking speed that suggested it could be in 2 places at once. The air in the room would grow heavy and cold, smelling of ozone and damp earth, as the voice rang out from the ceiling, filling the space with a knowledge that no mortal could possibly possess. But the entity's curiosity extended beyond the heavens and into the dark, private corners of the Red River settlement. It became a repository for the community's most shameful secrets. When neighbors came to witness the phenomenon, the voice would often greet them by name before they had even crossed the threshold, beginning to reveal their most hidden transgressions. It spoke of unpaid debts, secret affairs, and petty thefts committed in the dark of night, speaking with a glee that felt entirely malevolent. The farmhouse became a theater of the macabre. People would travel for days, drawn by a mixture of dread and morbid fascination, only to be publicly humiliated by a disembodied voice that knew the contents of their pockets and the hidden thoughts of their hearts. The entity seemed to thrive on this attention, its voice growing louder and more confident as its audience expanded. It was during this period that it introduced its family. At times, the room would erupt with 4 other distinct voices: Black Dog, Mathematics, Psychopathy, and Jerusalem, each with their own personality and tone, creating a chaotic, multi-layered chorus that sounded like a crowded room of invisible guests, all vying for the chance to mock the living. Throughout this expansion of the haunting, one target remained at the center of the entity's absolute rage: John Bell. It called him Old Jack, a nickname spat with a venom that made the skin crawl and the blood run cold. While it might sing sweet hymns to his wife, Lucy, whom it claimed to love and respect, it reserved a special cruelty for the patriarch. It would interrupt his evening prayers with body-drinking songs and curses that would make a sailor blush, its voice growing gravelly and deep when it spoke directly to him. It promised him, in a low, terrifying growl, that it would never leave until he was in his grave. The psychological toll was visible in the way John's shoulders began to stoop, and his eyes became hollowed by a profound lack of sleep. The sentience of the voice meant there was no escape, no corner of the 1,000-acre farm where its mockery could not reach. It was a transition from a haunting to a calculated siege, a slow and deliberate breaking of a man's spirit by a voice that never needed to breathe, never needed to rest, and seemed to find its greatest joy in the slow, agonizing unraveling of a family's peace. The Bell home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the jailer was a voice that knew everything and forgot nothing. The news of the haunting traveled through the damp, rolling valleys of Tennessee like a slow-moving storm. It drifted along the banks of the Red River, whispered in the humid heat of general stores and across the porches of tobacco farms, until it reached the ears of a man who was not easily unsettled. In the late summer of 1819, Major General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans and a future president, decided he would see this spirit for himself. He was a man of flint and iron, a soldier who had stared down the barrels of British muskets without flinching, and he viewed the tailies of the Bell family with a weary, professional skepticism. To Jackson, the world was a place of tangible threats and logical consequences, and he gathered a party of his most trusted men, along with a wagon laden with provisions, to ride from Nashville to the Bell homestead. They traveled under a heavy, amber sun, the wheels of their heavy wagon churning the thick, red clay of the road into fine, copper dust that coated their throats and the manes of their horses. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the drone of cicadas, a relentless, vibrating sound that seemed to pulse in time with the rhythmic clatter of the journey. Jackson rode at the head of the column, his back straight as a saber, confident that his presence alone would be enough to expose the trickery that surely lay at the heart of the Robertson County mystery. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged silhouette of the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the path, the party reached the final stretch of road leading to the Bell property. Suddenly, without warning or the sound of a snapping axle, the heavy provision wagon came to a dead, grinding halt. The horses strained in their harnesses, their muscles bulging and slick with sweat as they leaned into the weight, but the wagon remained as immobile as if it had been welded to the very bedrock of the earth. The driver cracked his whip, the sharp sound echoing like a pistol shot through the sudden silence of the woods, but the wheels refused to turn even a fraction of an inch. Jackson's men dismounted, their boots thudding softly into the dirt as they hurried to the wheels, expecting to find a hidden stump or a deep rut in the clay. They found nothing. The ground was smooth, the wheels were clear, yet the wagon was gripped by an invisible, unfathomable anchor. A cold, prickling sensation began to creep up the spines of the soldiers as they pushed with all their collective might, their grunts of exertion the only sound in the darkening woods. Andrew Jackson watched from his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he took in the impossible physics of the scene. Finally, he laughed, a dry, sharp sound that carried no mirth, and exclaimed that by the eternal, it must be the witch. No sooner had the words left his lips than a voice rose from the undergrowth. a voice that was neither human nor animal, but possessed a strange, metallic resonance that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. The entity spoke with a chilling clarity, telling the general that the wagon could move on now, and that she would see him again that very night. The wagon lurched forward instantly, the horses nearly stumbling as the unseen resistance vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The party continued in a stunned, heavy silence toward the Bell farmhouse, where the flickering light of tallow candles in the windows offered a fragile sense of sanctuary against the encroaching night. John Bell welcomed the general with the weary grace of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the impossible. Among Jackson's entourage was a man who called himself a witch-layer, a self-proclaimed expert in the occult who boasted loudly of his bravery. He carried a heavy horse pistol loaded with a silver bullet, polished until it shone like a cold star, and he spent the evening regaling the group with tales of how he had vanquished spirits in the past. Jackson, sitting in a ladder-back chair by the hearth, watched the man with a mixture of amusement and disdain, whispering to his aides that he suspected the fellow was an arrant coward. The room was filled with the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, the shadows dancing on the log walls as the fire crackled. The atmosphere was thick, almost pressurized, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The witch-layer paced the floor, his hand resting arrogantly on the butt of his pistol, claiming that the entity was afraid to show its face while he was present. He did not have to wait long for a response. The silence was shattered by the sound of light, rapid footfalls prancing across the floorboards, though nothing was visible to the eye. The same metallic, disembodied voice from the road announced that she was indeed at hand and ready for business. The witch-layer froze, his face draining of color until it matched the silver bullet in his belt. Suddenly, the man began to twist and writhe as if gripped by powerful, unseen hands. He let out a strangled cry, claiming that sharp pins were being driven into his flesh, and then his head snapped back as his nose was visibly pulled by an invisible force, dragging him across the room. The sound of heavy, wet slaps echoed through the parlor, and the man's skin began to redden with the marks of strikes delivered by nothing but the air. The entity laughed, a high, mocking sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once, and demanded that the braggart use his silver bullet. The man, now weeping with terror and pain, scrambled toward the door, his dignity discarded like ash. He fled out into the black Tennessee night, the sound of his frantic footsteps fading into the distance as the entity taunted him, calling him a rascal and a fraud. The room fell into a terrifyingly heavy quiet, the remaining men huddled together, their eyes darting toward the rafters and the dark corners where the candlelight could not reach. Jackson remained in his chair, his jaw set, having witnessed a display of power that no military strategy could counter. The rest of the night was a blurred vigil of whispered prayers and the rhythmic, unsettling sounds of the house groaning under the weight of the haunting. The entity did not strike Jackson personally, but she made her presence felt in the shifting of the furniture and the soft, mocking whispers that drifted through the hallways like a cold draft. When the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the shutters, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the general's men were already saddling the horses with trembling hands. They did not wait for breakfast. As they rode away from the Bell farm, heading back toward the relative safety of Nashville, Jackson looked back at the house one last time. He would later be quoted as saying that he would rather fight the entire British army single-handed than face the Bell Witch again. The experience had carved a permanent mark into his memory, a rare instance where the iron-willed general found himself humbled by a force he could not see, could not shoot, and could not command. The road back felt longer, the woods deeper and more secretive, as if the spirit were watching their retreat with a satisfied, predatory gaze. The visit of the general did not end the haunting, but it solidified the legend in the historical record of the young nation. Even as they reached the bustling streets of Nashville, The memory of that metallic voice and the immovable wagon remained with them, a reminder that in the wild reaches of the Red River, there were things that even the most powerful men in the world could not control. The winter of 1820 did not simply arrive in Robertson County. It descended like a heavy, suffocating shroud, damp and biting, clinging to the rough-hewn wooden siding of the Bell farmhouse. Outside, the Red River ran slow and dark beneath a thin, jagged crust of ice, and the surrounding woods of Middle Tennessee stood like silent, gray skeletons against a pale and leaden sky. Inside the house, the air was perpetually thin, laden with the metallic scent of wood smoke and the sharp, medicinal odor of vinegar and camphor that seemed to seep from the very walls. Every floorboard seemed to hold its breath in the gathering gloom. The usual nocturnal terrors, the rhythmic scratching at the heavy oak doors, the sounds of invisible dogs tearing at each other in the frozen yard, and the relentless, bone-shaking pounding on the exterior walls, had suddenly given way to a heavy, expectant silence that felt even more malevolent than the noise. In the center of this gathering darkness was John Bell, the man who had once been a pillar of the community, a man who had carved a prosperous life out of the untamed wilderness, was now a fragile, shivering figure, his vitality drained away by a presence that no one could see but everyone could feel. He sat in his heavy chair by the hearth, his fingers trembling as they traced the deep, familiar grain of the wood, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to thicken and pulse with a secret, rhythmic life of their own. The firelight flickered across his face, casting long, dancing shadows that made him look like a stranger to his own family. His physical decline had been a slow, agonizing unraveling of the nerves and the spirit. It had started months earlier with a strange, persistent twitching in his facial muscles, a rhythmic, involuntary fluttering of the skin near his eye that he had initially tried to dismiss as simple exhaustion or the strain of the harvest. But the twitching soon grew into something much more sinister and uncontrollable. His jaw would lock for minutes at a time, his tongue feeling thick and unresponsive in a mouth that had once commanded absolute respect and order. By the time the first heavy snows of December arrived, the paralysis had stolen his voice entirely, leaving him only with a series of guttural, frustrated sounds that tore at the hearts of his children. The spirit, sensing that her long-promised victory was finally near, took a cruel, audible delight in his silence. She would hover unseen in the rafters, her disembodied voice echoing through the cold chamber, mocking his slurred attempts to pray or speak to his devoted wife, Lucy. She called him Old Jack Bell, a nickname that she turned into a sharp, stinging curse. When he would finally find the fleeting strength to close his eyes and seek a moment of rest, the entity would violently rip the heavy wool blankets from his body, leaving him to shiver in the sub-zero drafts that whistled through the chinking of the logs. She would slap his face with invisible hands until his skin was bruised and red, laughing with a shrill, metallic cackle that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of his bones. When the dawn of December 19th broke over the frosted hills, it brought a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. When John Jr. pushed open the heavy, groaning bedroom door, the flickering light from his single tallow candle revealed his father lying perfectly still, his head thrown back against the pillows in a way that suggested a sudden, total collapse of the will. He had fallen into a deep, unnatural stupor, a coma so profound that no amount of shouting, weeping, or frantic shaking could break his bond with the darkness. His skin had taken on the color of old, weathered parchment, and a strange, sickly sweet scent, reminiscent of crushed garlic and stagnant water, clung to his shallow, ragged breath. The family gathered at his bedside in the dim morning light, their faces etched with the profound fatigue of years of torment, their own shadows stretching long and distorted against the timber walls. John Jr., his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and a cold, rising adrenaline, reached for the small medicine cupboard where the family's simple remedies were kept. He expected to find the usual vials of laudanum and clear herbal tinctures. But as his fingers brushed against the cool glass of the shelf, he realized something was horribly wrong. There, sitting prominently at the front of the cupboard, was a vial he had never seen before. It was a small, round container of thick, hand-blown glass, and within it swirled a liquid that was dark and smoky, shifting with a murky, iridescent sheen that seemed to catch the dim light in an unsettling, oily way, as if the shadows themselves had been liquefied and bottled. As the family stood paralyzed, staring at the mysterious container, the oppressive silence of the room was shattered by a sound that made the blood run cold in their veins. It was the voice of the witch, but it was no longer the playful, mimicry-filled tone they had grown accustomed to. Her voice was now resonant, heavy, and dripping with a terrifying, absolute triumph. "It is useless for you to try to relieve old Jack," she crooned, the sound appearing to emanate from the very air in the center of the room, vibrating the floorboards beneath their feet. "I have got him this time. He will never get up from that bed again." She began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves skittering over a marble gravestone. "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night while he was fast asleep," she boasted, her voice growing louder and more confident. "I put it there in the cupboard myself. That fixed him." The horror of her admission settled over the room like a physical weight. Desperate to know the true nature of the substance, John Jr. took the vial into the kitchen, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. He called for the family's barn cat, and with a heavy heart and trembling fingers, let 2 small drops of the dark, smoky liquid fall onto the animal's tongue. The effect was instantaneous. The cat gave a single, muffled cry before its entire body went rigid, its eyes glazing over as it collapsed onto the floorboards, stone dead before its small frame even touched the wood. The reality was undeniable. The entity had moved from psychological torture to cold-blooded murder. John Bell lingered through the long, freezing night, his heart finally giving out just as the sun began to peek over the frost-covered horizon on the morning of December 20th, 1820. The house, which had been a frantic theater of the supernatural for over 3 years, felt suddenly and hollowly empty. In a fit of desperate rage and bone-deep grief, John Jr. seized the mysterious vial of poison and hurled it into the middle of the roaring kitchen fireplace. The moment the glass shattered against the logs, the flames did not simply flare up, they transformed into something otherworldly. A brilliant, terrifyingly beautiful blue flame erupted from the hearth, shooting high up the chimney with a roar that shook the very foundations of the house. It was a color that belonged to no natural wood fire, a vivid, electric azure that seemed to burn with a cold, chemical intensity that scorched the eyes. While some would later point to this as the clear signature of burning arsenic, to the family in that room, it was the literal fire of the abyss. Even at his funeral, the spirit refused to let the patriarch rest. As the long procession moved toward the family graveyard under the gray December sky, her voice followed them through the trees, singing loud, body-drinking songs and mocking the tears of the mourners with cruel, high-pitched laughter. She remained present until the last shovel of red Tennessee clay was packed onto the grave, leaving behind a family shattered, and a community forever changed by the knowledge that a spirit had, for the first and only time in the history of the nation, been held responsible for the death of a man. The blue flame had gone out, but the shadows in the Red River Valley would never truly lift. The funeral of John Bell was an affair draped in the heavy, gray dampness of a Tennessee winter in early 1821. Hundreds of mourners gathered, their boots sinking into the soft, red clay of the river bottom as they stood in a somber circle around the fresh wound in the earth. 3 preachers, 2 Methodists and 1 Baptist, offered long, earnest eulogies, their voices rising against the biting wind that whipped through the bare branches of the oak trees. But as the last clod of dirt hit the wooden casket with a dull, final thud, the silence was shattered. A voice, high and jarringly cheerful, erupted from the empty air above the mourners. It did not weep, it sang. It belted out a rowdy, rhythmic drinking song about a bottle of brandy, the lyrics sharp and clear against the weeping of the family. The spirit, which had once called itself Kate, was not finished with the bells. It laughed a wild, echoing laugh that seemed to bounce off the very headstones, a sound that lingered in the ears of the townspeople long after they had fled the graveyard. Back at the farmhouse, the vial of black liquid that had ended John's life was cast into the hearth. As the glass shattered, a pillar of brilliant, unnatural blue flame shot up the chimney, vanishing into the cold afternoon sky. And then, as quickly as the madness had begun 4 years earlier, the farm fell into a deep, unsettling quiet. The entity whispered a final promise to the widow, Lucy. It would depart for a season, but it would return in 7 years' time. For 7 years, the Red River settlement breathed. The seasons turned with a gentle, predictable rhythm that the Bell family had almost forgotten. Springtimes brought the sweet, heavy scent of honeysuckle and the buzzing of bees in the clover, undisturbed by the sound of invisible hands slapping at the air. The summers were long and golden, the heat shimmering over the tobacco fields while the family worked in a peace that felt fragile, like thin glass. Lucy Bell, whom the spirit had always treated with a strange, protective reverence, lived her days in the quiet dignity of her mourning. The children grew. Betsy moved toward a life away from the shadow of her former torment, though the memory of those invisible welts surely remained etched in her mind. But as the year 1828 approached, a tension began to settle over the farm once more, like the static before a thunderstorm. The family found themselves glancing toward the dark corners of the ceiling or pausing in the hallway, listening for the scratch of a claw that wasn't there. They watched the calendar with a heavy heart, counting down the months until the 7-year slumber was meant to end. The air seemed to grow thicker, the shadows in the orchard stretching longer than they should, as if the very land was bracing itself for the return of its most famous guest. In the late months of 1828, the promise was kept. The knocking returned, but it was different now, less violent, more contemplative. The entity did not seek to bruise or break. Instead, it sought the company of John Bell, Jr. For 3 weeks, the spirit took up residence in the house once more, engaging the younger John in long, winding conversations that stretched deep into the hollow of the night. They sat in the flickering amber light of the tallow candles, a man and a ghost, discussing the vast complexities of the universe. The voice spoke of the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, the nature of the soul, and the deep, spiritual awakenings that would one day sweep across the land. It even peered into the murky fog of the future, speaking of a great and terrible conflict that would one day tear the nation apart, a prophecy of the Civil War that would not arrive for another 33 years. John Jr. listened, mesmerized and exhausted, as the spirit shared secrets that seemed too heavy for a mortal mind to carry. When the 3 weeks reached their end, the voice grew soft and distant. It told him it was leaving again, but that it would visit his most direct descendant in exactly 107 years. With a final, faint rustle of the curtains, the presence evaporated, leaving the house to the cold moonlight and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. As the decades passed and the original Bell cabin crumbled into the earth, the legend migrated. It found a permanent home in the dark, damp recesses of the Bell Witch Cave, a natural limestone cavern that cuts deep into the bluffs overlooking the Red River. The air inside the cave is a constant, shivering 57 degrees, smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Visitors today speak of a heavy pressure on their chests as they move through the narrow passages, the feeling of invisible eyes watching from the crevices where the light of a lantern cannot reach. There are stories of a young boy who once became wedged in a tight crawl space, his breath coming in panicked gasps as the cold rock pressed against his ribs. Legend says an invisible force seized him by the ankles and pulled him free, followed by a sharp, feminine voice that scolded him to be more careful in the darkness. Others have captured photographs of shimmering, heat-like waves standing in the mouth of the cave, or heard the faint, melodic sound of a woman singing hymns that fades into the drip of water against the floor. The cave remains a place where the barrier between our world and the next seems worn thin, a threshold made of shadow and limestone, where the echo of a 200-year-old haunting refuses to die. The land remembers what happened to the bells, and it holds on to the mystery with a grip as cold as the river in winter. The year 1935 came and went, and while some say the spirit made a quiet return to the descendants of John Bell, no great storm of terror was unleashed. Perhaps the entity had finally found its peace, or perhaps it simply became a part of the atmosphere itself. A lingering chill in the Adams air, a sudden rustle in the cornfields when there is no wind. The Bell Witch remains the only case in the history of the United States where a death was officially attributed to a supernatural being, a dark milestone in our understanding of the unknown. We are left with the image of a family pushed to the brink, of a daughter's stolen happiness, and of a father who could not escape a fate whispered to him from the shadows. The story has transitioned from a private tragedy into an eternal legend, a tale told to children to make them pull their blankets a little tighter. As we leave the shores of the Red River behind, the echoes of that high, mocking laughter grow faint. The fields are quiet now, and the river flows on, indifferent to the ghosts of the past. The mystery of what truly haunted the Bell family may never be solved, and perhaps it is better that way. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the deep, cool earth of the Tennessee Valley. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.